Hello, everyone. My name is Nora Gelprin. I'm the Director of Sexuality Education and Training at Advocates for Youth, and happy to be your moderator for today's webinar. Just wanted to give you a couple of pieces of information about the American School Health Association before we go ahead and introduce Joel. So just as a reminder, what the mission is of ASHA is to transform all schools, which I love, into places where every student learns and thrives. ASHA envisions healthy students who learn and achieve in safe and healthy environments, nurtured by caring adults, which I'm guessing is all of us, functioning within coordinated school and community support systems. So just a reminder of the mission of ASHA and how today's webinar fits within that mission. Couple of pieces of other information. If you join ASHA, which I have for over a decade, proud ASHA member, you'll see a list of all of the member benefits. It's a really tremendous organization, from reading the monthly journal to attending the conference to lots of continuing education opportunities like today's webinar. So highly encourage you to consider joining as a member if you haven't already. Also, just a reminder for folks who are able to join us at the annual conference. This year it's going to be in Cincinnati, October 2nd through the 4th, lovely Ohio. I'm already saved the dates and have my flights already. Excited to join many of our colleagues to really look at critical school health issues. So hope you can join us as well. And I'm excited to stop talking and turn it over to Joel Baum from Gender Spectrum. Just going to read you his bio so we can get a better sense of Joel's experience that leads him to be leading this exciting webinar for us today. So Joel Baum is the Senior Director for Professional Development at Gender Spectrum. Joel is responsible for overseeing all aspects of the organization's education and training efforts. He facilitates trainings, develops curriculum, consults with caregivers and professionals, and provides resources in service of a more compassionate understanding of gender and young people. An educator for more than 30 years, his career has been marked by commitment to social justice and equity. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joel Baum, today's presenter.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora and Caitlin. Again, my name's Joel Baum, and as mentioned, I'm the Senior Director for Professional Development here at Gender Spectrum. Just so excited to have this opportunity to partner with ASHA and talk about some work that's very near and dear to me. You know, as Nora mentioned, I've been an educator for gosh, now more like 35 years. But even before I went to college, I taught puberty and sex education in Salt Lake City, Utah, working for Planned Parenthood. And that was long before I had any notions of where I was going in my career. And even remember then just how much I enjoyed this, this content and talking about this topic. So it really has been part of my life really forever. I'm going to go ahead and actually hide myself. That's in everyone's best interest as we do the presentation. And I want to start by just sharing a little bit about Gender Spectrum. Our organization is a nonprofit that works all over the country to help create gender-inclusive worlds for young people. And the way we try to do that work is by engaging people in conversations about gender and the varied ways we are thinking and talking about gender today, and then ask them to consider the implications for whatever work they do with kids and families. That means we're not a program, we're not a curriculum. We really try to act in partnership and really work with folks to consider notions of gender and how they then are going to play out for you and the work you do. And that certainly is something that has to be done when it comes to teaching puberty education. And so with that, you know, there's three really important principles we've learned in doing this work. And the first is how critical it is to simply meet people where they are when it comes to their understandings of gender. We all, you know, have been socialized however we have been socialized. We've had the experiences we've had, and so far be it from us to sit in some kind of judgment of others about what their experiences have been. But as a dear friend of mine once said, it's okay not to know, but once you know, you can't not know. And then you need to think about what you want to do about that. And that's very much the work we're trying to do is engaging in that question. Secondly, we know that when we're talking about gender as a concept, it's one thing. But when we talk about gender in the lived experience that young people are having, we need to think about how gender intersects with every aspect of a young person's life, where they live, the families they're living with, the religion and race and region and language, and all these other aspects of who they are inform their experience of gender. And then lastly, again, while many people assume this work is about transgender and non-binary students, and of course the work includes those young people who are having very challenging times in many cases at school, gender impacts all kids. And so as we do the work we do, we really try to emphasize not just trans inclusion, but in fact gender inclusion. How are we in fact thinking about gender of all young people? Before I dive into the guide, I did want to thank our partners. These wonderful organizations really have helped us develop this content. We, for many years, have been asked about how to think about gender in terms of puberty and health education. And about 3 years ago, these 6 organizations put together a call to action, specifically around the needs of more LGBTQ inclusive puberty and sex education. And upon seeing that and thinking about this issue more broadly, they were just natural, and as many of you, in fact, are parts of these organizations, wonderful partners to do this work. So again, really great resources with all 6 of them. The plan for today is essentially as follows. We're going to spend about 30 minutes or so talking about the principles, and then have Q&A. Specifically, I want to frame the guide, sort of locate it, if you will, then provide an overview of the actual principles themselves and ways to think about them. We'll talk briefly about the notion of separating students, because it comes up every time. And then, as we said, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A, and Nora will help facilitate that. So we want to start actually with some polls that we're going to do with you. And so this way you'll be able to participate. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll, and just take a few seconds to answer these questions. Where are you from? What you do? And are you a parent? So go ahead and take a look. There are 3 questions here. So go ahead and check the box that's appropriate for you. And I'm hoping that's working, but I don't see anyone filling it out. Oh, there we go. There's someone filling it out. Okay, there you go. Now, I will tell you, there's 74 of you here, so, well, we're not going to wait for every single person. Yeah, great. Now folks are diving in there. And just take maybe 10 more seconds to go ahead and fill in those 3 questions. All right. Great. So go ahead and click that last box. I'm going to end the poll, and let's take a look at the results. So looking at where folks are from, it looks like a third of us are from the Pacific Coast region, and then that's followed with a really even spread from across the country, and even about 10% of folks from outside the United States. In terms of people's individual roles, it looks like the largest group are health educators who work with an agency that indeed works with schools. But you can also see we have a number of teachers, we have a number of counselors, and really a wide range of folks from various locations. And I'm always curious what those others look like. And then in terms of whether we're parents or not, looks like about, 57% of us are. And 43%, I should say, 25 of us are not. There is one other poll that I want to ask you, which is in terms of who you actually work with. So if you can just give us an indication of the audiences that you're typically working with in terms of schools, that would be great. And folks are clearly getting a hang of this, so just give you a few more seconds there. Great, and thank you for that. And again, let's take a look. I think not surprisingly, the largest group is people working, or middle school is certainly the largest group with which people are working. We have a few folks doing preschool stuff, and you can see the others as well. But clearly, our audience is working with young people across the span of childhood and beyond. So thank you so much for letting us know who's in the room, if you will. I'm going to put that away, and let's go on. So let's talk about the principles themselves. What I really want to do is tell you, first of all, what this document is. It really is a set of principles. It's a framework, if you will, for supporting healthy bodies and healthy relationships. It's also important to know what it isn't. This document does not represent a curriculum in and of itself. Instead, it's a lens in which you can focus concepts of gender diversity into whatever curriculum you're working with. And it also is not designed to be an actual training about sex or sex development, gender, or sexual orientation. And again, really important to know that. And in particular, these principles are applicable to all young people. So as you think about the work you're doing, again, continue to recognize that we're not just talking about subgroups. We're talking about all young people, even while attending to the needs of some individual students within that. When we talk about what puberty and health education is, generally we're talking about changing bodies that occur during adolescence, and sometimes we go on to talk about healthy relationships, sexuality, pregnancy and STI prevention, things like consent, and many, many other topics. And in some cases, none of those get covered. And in general, this is introduced in grades 4 through 6, though again, not universally. So we're going to do one more poll here. And what I want to now hear from you is, when did you actually have an opportunity to learn this content? So when you were growing up, when did you first receive puberty education at school? All right, take a second or two more, and let's take a look. All right, so we can see that roughly a third of you had this content in 5th grade, which, again, usually 4th through 6th grade is where we see this. Interestingly, at least one person in 3rd grade, a few more in 4th. Again, we have a nice bell curve, and we also have at least 6% who never had this instruction. And again, I think that's probably quite representative of what we're seeing across the country when it comes to this particular content. So, excuse me. So when we do this work, we like to talk about it sitting within a larger context. And certainly when you're doing work related to puberty education and trying to be inclusive, it gets far more traction when the school itself is working to be gender inclusive. And what we mean by that is that the school works to intentionally recognize that gender diversity exists in all facets of our society, and then it demonstrates through a variety of policies, procedures, and practices a commitment to respecting the unique gender of every child. And really what those schools are asking is, how are they accounting for the unique gender of all students? And it's in schools that are doing this work that this work really becomes more integrated. However, doing gender inclusive schoolwork is not at all a requirement for being gender inclusive in puberty ed, but it creates conditions that really do help make that work take hold. And why is that so important that we're including all genders in talking about this? Well, again, this creates better learning and life outcomes for all young people. We know, for instance, that when we do this kind of work, we see increases in academic success and improved school climates. We have evidence of increases in the well-being of individuals in intimate relationships. And also when folks are getting this content in an appropriate manner, we see a reduction down the road in sexual harassment and dating violence. What we really believe is that this work is life-affirming for every young person. Let's face it, puberty is a pretty critical and for many difficult time for all adolescents. And we also know in some cases it's life-saving for some of our young people, given the experience that trans and non-binary youth are sometimes having in our schools, and some of the consequent indicators of a lack of health and wellness that are consequences of some of that treatment. So that's just a little bit about framing this work and both why it is and how we want you to be thinking about it. So now let's talk about the principles themselves. There are 5 overarching principles that we believe will really lead to, again, a much deeper and richer conversation about puberty and health, and also grounded in a broader understanding of gender. And so the first of those principles is simply the idea of establishing some level of gender literacy. And by gender literacy, we really mean helping people understand that gender is more than our bodies, that in fact, when we think about an individual's gender, we have to think about these 3 aspects: body, identity, and expression. And that as we think about each one of those, each of them exists rather than a binary, but as a spectrum. In other words, a big part of gender literacy is helping young people understand that gender is more complex than a binary system allows for. We're not saying that the binary doesn't work for many kids. In fact, it does. That's why it's the predominant model. But we're also saying, and for some people it doesn't. And that's okay too. And that in order to understand an individual's gender, we need to know a little bit about each one of these. We also want to frame all of that under the idea of gender congruence. And this is a really critical piece of gender literacy, because if you think about those 3 dimensions, right, each one of them exists unto itself, but they also exist in relationship to each other. And that's what we mean by gender congruence, that for each of us, those 3 dimensions can be in different degrees of balance or harmony or agreement with each other for that particular individual. What we mean by congruence is that sense of it's just right. And for many of us who are cisgender, that is, identify with the sex we were assigned at birth, finding congruence isn't that difficult, because we walk in a world that's sort of already congruent with our experience. For some of our young people, they don't necessarily have that. And so they will look to seek congruence measures in any one of those domains, which could include, a changing name or a change in clothing or some other form of expression. It may mean that they seek some kind of legal support to be seen more and recognized officially in various locations. It may mean that they pursue some kind of medical congruence measures to bring those into harmony. And again, to be very clear, when we talk about congruence, we're not talking about congruence with the rest of the world. We're talking about an internal sense of balance, of agreement, of harmony, of being in sync. It's a hard thing to capture, but it's sort of like when you're driving and you just catch every green light. You're just in sync. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about congruence. And finally, we also have to recognize that when we're thinking about gender, we're also talking about gender in the context of all of our identities, and that gender is ultimately personal. Each one of us has a unique experience that, while even though we share some aspects with other people, the way all of it comes together is truly unique for each one of us. And I'm reminded of a principal who was asked by one of their staff people, why are we doing this training around gender? I mean, how many of those students do we have? And without missing a beat, she said, oh, all of them, because they all have gender, and that's what this work is about. We also need to be able to differentiate gender and sexual orientation because they are different components of a person's identity. And while related, gender is extremely personal. That's my own experience. Sexual orientation is based on my attractions, physical, romantic, sexual, to others. And it's interpersonal. And distinguishing them becomes really important both for accuracy, for seeing our kids for who they are. For instance, we frequently confuse expression for an indicator of someone's sexual orientation. And finally, we need to distinguish these so we're not sexualizing the gender identity formation process of a young person. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about shared gender spaces like bathrooms and others. In terms of what it looks like to implement this idea of gender literacy, there's lots of ways it plays out.
What a person likes to wear isn't determined by their gender.
We don't know what someone's gender is just by looking at them.
Well, many of us have been taught that genitals define our gender. Our gender is richer and more complex than that.
And why this is so critical is that we need to help youth recognize there's not just one way to do this thing we call gender. And part of our job as parents and caring adults is to open up possibilities for kids instead of limiting them. It also gives them tools to help understand their own gender and the gender of their peers. And when we talk about this with kids, we're also sending an important message about being open to hearing about their gender and creating space for them to share with us as the adults in their lives. The second principle is the importance of distinguishing patterns from rules and builds right off principle number one. What we're talking about are the various ways that there are patterns with bodies, with identity, with expression, but none of those are absolutes.
Some people are intersex, which means that their body is different from bodies labeled as male or female.
Frequently, people born with a vulva grow up and identify as women, but not always.
And I apologize if these lines aren't matching up. I will share the proper language. These got adjusted.
Most boys don't wear dresses, but some do.
What we're talking about in this regard is really helping young people recognize that may be true for many people, but not all people. When we're talking about gender inclusion, we're not getting rid of gender. We're not saying that there aren't certain things that we notice as patterns. We're just helping people understand they're not absolutes, and that if you or someone you know doesn't fit that typical pattern, you're not doing something wrong. Too often, when it comes to gender, when a young person doesn't fit the expectations, doesn't fit the pattern, rather than the people around them saying, oh, look at you in your uniqueness, we actually blame them for doing something wrong or violating a rule.
That may be true for some people, but not all people.
More common and less common.
Frequently, but not always.
And so adding this kind of language whenever we're talking about bodies or expression or identity or many of the other components that we talk about in this content, we want to move away from those absolutes. And this is not just helpful in this content, but really can help kids throughout their lives. It really helps kids, even our youngest students, see the world beyond the absolutes and describes, in fact, the world they see all around them. It also deepens their critical thinking and ultimately supports them to be better citizens as they confront complex issues facing our country. The third principle is the importance of emphasizing physiology instead of gender. What we're talking about here is being very clear that we're not gendering bodies, but talking about their functions. We're trying to convey very important physiological terms, definitions, and functions, and describing the parts that different bodies have without automatically connecting them to a particular gender. So you can again see how at first gender literacy is critical, but the patterns versus rules piece also becomes important.
For those who have ovaries, the pituitary glands and ovaries interact to start menstruation.
For those who have testicles, that is where sperm cells are produced.
Rather than saying women in women, the pituitary gland will start this happening, right? Well, you have individuals that have uteruses and ovaries that don't identify as women, and you have some women who don't have uteruses and ovaries. But instead, we're talking about the bodies themselves. And an important aspect of this, and a question we get a lot, particularly related to trans and non-binary kids, is because they don't feel represented in the classroom, they're not hearing critical information about the bodies they do have and need to take care of. And so what can happen is they feel invisible in the classroom as we're talking about taking care of our bodies, and therefore don't get critical information. If you're a transgender boy, that is a boy that has been assigned the sex of a female when he was born, you still need to take care of the body you do have. You may ultimately modify that body, and we'll talk about that in the next principle, but the body you have needs to be understood and cared for. We need to talk about why we're doing this, helping again recognize the health implications, the importance of accurate language, and the importance of understanding that there aren't universal rules when it comes to these bodies. What we're trying to do here is promote attention to one's health regardless of the body they have, and to increase people's confidence as they use the appropriate language and academic language, as well as reducing shame about bodies as they come to understand that bodies are something that is part of every human's experience. And we do all have a body. It's not necessarily the definer of our gender, but it is still a body that needs care. And this is where this principle becomes so important. Too often, the trope in this work has been little boys grow up to be like their daddies and little girls grow up to be like their mommies. And we need to move away and, in fact, communicate that there are many different pathways to our adult bodies. But we will all have an adult body, but there's a lot of ways to get there. In other words, we, again, don't want to define things as becoming a woman means that you have these parts. Instead, it means there will be differences in when you go through puberty. There will be differences in your appearance. There will be certain changes associated with puberty. And there may be times when we have to manage various medical approaches. We have to manage our puberty through various medical approaches. But we're helping kids, again, understand that there's a lot of ways to get there to the destination. One way to help them think about this is to encourage them to think about the messages that we get about what constitutes a man or a woman and how well those expectations really fit anyone's experience. We need to recognize that when we describe multiple pathways, it makes each kid's experience uniquely their own. In other words, I'm not the kid who's doing it wrong. You know, too often our kids are sitting there thinking, why don't I have hair down there? Oh my gosh, why do I have so much hair down there? Why am I not getting bigger? Why am I so big? You know, all these different ideas where they're comparing themselves to some assumed norm. And by talking about many roads, it helps every young person in the space recognize that whatever path you're on, that's okay. And that sometimes you will need assistance from doctors to get where you want. So for whether it's related to precocious puberty, whether it's related to some kind of need for hormone support related to some deficiency in hormones, or whether it's related to needing to get your body to be congruent with other aspects of your gender, all of these are possible roads to the adult bodies that kids will have. And finally, it's a wonderful way to both deepen empathy and, in fact, celebrate the complexity of how our bodies work. And the last principle, excuse me, is to communicate to our students that there are many distinct pathways to families. Families, again, don't get created in just one way. We, first of all, of course, in this content, need to be able to talk about how babies are born. How do young little babies come into our world? So they need to understand fertilization, embryonic growth, the developmental milestones. But we don't need to connect those automatically to gender. We need to talk then also about how various families can be created, because we want all of our kids to imagine a pathway to the family that they imagine for themselves. And certainly in today's world, our kids are coming from so many different places. I mean, even in my own experience, one of my daughters is adopted, the other one was a product of an egg donor, and they both represent just the incredible diversity of pathways to the families that they're going to find themselves in. Some ways to do this in terms of implementation is using current events in inclusive books. So again, Michelle Obama's biography talks about that they use reproductive technologies. And in fact, over the last 30 years, 1 million babies have been born through those processes. And in terms of the focus on gender diversity, there's a great book called Happy Families, which talks about a multiracial family with a trans parent. And important to know that between a third and half of transgender people in this country are parents themselves, once more helping them see many pathways. There's a lot of great children's literature out there that also helps promote this understanding of the many, many different ways families get formed. Doing this is such an important aspect of this work, because it really does deepen the appreciation for the things that make each one of our families unique, and also the traditions and histories. And when children see that families come in various shapes and sizes, they can begin to understand that what makes a family isn't whether you're genetically related, whether there's this parent and that parent. It's that love is what really makes a family. And that when we begin to see families as all wonderful examples of that love, we build respect for communities and strengthen the communities that are formed in that process. So again, those are the 5 principles. We'll talk about them and review them one more time. But one other thing we need to talk about is this question of separating or not separating. To what extent and how are students being grouped? And so we're going to ask you one last question about your own experience. And that specifically is, what was your experience with learning this content growing up? When you received puberty education, how were the students grouped? Go ahead and take a second to answer that. All right, maybe take just a second more. All right, thank you for that. And let's take a look. And as we see here, an overwhelming, 2/3 essentially of the group, students were separated by sex for the majority of the instruction. In some cases, they were separated for some of the instruction, and very few of you experienced where all the students were together. And as always, some of us just don't recall, or unfortunately, again, did not receive any of this instruction. When we're doing our trainings with schools, we see more and more this question coming up. What about, the separation of students? And what's making it increasingly complex is that we as a society are recognizing the complexity of gender. And a very clear example is there are now, I believe, 6 or 7 different states. I mean, I just read that 3 other states have come on to actually allowing individuals to have gender markers other than male or female, which are in fact really sex markers, on their driver's licenses. So if we're separating by gender or sex, are we now separating into male, female, or boy, girl, and non-binary? Are we talking about intersex, or are we talking, right? I mean, suddenly, where are we drawing these lines? So let's talk about some of the questions that come up related to this topic. Oops. What we know is there are certain fears that frequently get raised about having all the kids together. They include that, students will be embarrassed to ask questions in front of other kids of different genders. And this is often said that, especially for the girls, there's often a concern that, some of the kids will really start to try to show off in front of the other genders, and that's often assumed to be the boys. There's often an assumption that parents will object because most of them, like most of us in today's session, we're taught in single gender groups, and that it's always been done this way. So these are some of the common fears that we see brought up about grouping kids together. What really matters is that there are trade-offs to doing it either way. And in our experience, the trade-offs, in other words, the negatives that occur when we separate kids are almost impossible to address, right, when they're separated. Whereas the negatives that people are concerned about having them all together, we in fact can address. So what do I mean by that? Well, so first of all, when kids are separate, they miss the opportunity to foster respect and communication across all genders and sexes, right? So when we have them separate, it's really hard to counter that, right? Now, again, we'll talk about the fears and how we address those. But another thing that a consequence of having kids separate is that we convey a strict sense of otherness. We automatically are telling kids that there's an otherness about different bodies and genders. And in many ways, that can lead to shame and a sense of secrecy, and something that is forbidden. It also prevents students from learning how to speak to one another about sensitive topics. And if we don't do that in the space of a classroom where we actually have some control of it, why are we going to believe that they're going to be able to talk about these things when they're in spaces, private spaces with people of different genders? Things about contraception and consent and respect and having needs met and positive sexuality. All of these things, kids need some practice being in mixed spaces as they seek to understand how to communicate. And for, again, some of our students who are trans or non-binary, we're now forcing them to pick one or the other. I can go in the group of people that have the same body that I have, which may mean that I'm now having to out myself in terms of my identity. Or I can go to a place where my identity is consistent with the other people in the room, but now my body may not be getting talked about. And we're putting kids in positions that really make an impossible decision. And in either case, they're going to miss essential information or the sense of affirmation. When we talk about having kids together, we can address most of those challenges through some simple strategies. Setting clear ground rules. So when we talk about, some kids will be embarrassed or some kids will misbehave, well, that's going to be true regardless of the configuration. But what we can do is set very clear ground rules, normalize that it might be a little uncomfortable to be in these spaces, but having faith in kids being able to handle it, giving them opportunities to kind of get their giggles out, but then turning to like the task at hand. Certainly this concern about, certain kids won't ask certain questions. And again, an assumption that particularly the girls won't ask questions in front of the boys. Well, first of all, that's a pretty binary way of thinking in a lot of regards. But the fact is, some girls won't ask questions and some boys won't. And some of our non-binary kids won't either. And yet some of them will. And regardless, we're going to use a question box. And every kid will have a Post-it or a card in which every kid will be required to write something on their card. Doesn't have to be a question. They can just draw a smiley face. And every kid will have an opportunity to just drop it in the box on the way out of class. So no one is being stigmatized as having asked a question. And it may be that if the question that you think isn't being asked, well, you're also part of the classroom, and you can simply say something to the effect of, in this classroom, someone has a question about this, knowing that they almost certainly do. But when kids are separated, they don't have that opportunity to get all those positives. And finally, by anticipating the commonly asked questions, you help create the conditions. By anticipating the common behaviors, you create the conditions that allow good teaching to take place. Simply because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean it's the way we should be doing it. And in today's complex world, we need to give our kids a little more credit for their ability to handle those spaces. And finally, if decisions get made to either create gendered groups or to occasionally or even for the entire program, you have to be very, very intentional about how you're going to address those things that we give up that I mentioned before that happens when we do separate kids, okay? And I wanted to share this quote from Wendy Sellers, who is the author of Puberty, The Wonder Years, which is, I know, a book and program that many schools use. She said, "I work with dozens of schools that do not divide students based on sex. Most use an anonymous question box so that all students can have their questions answered. They generally say that students behave better and more respectfully in mixed groups." And so I think in many ways, it's hard to imagine something we've never done or experienced. And yet there are a growing number of individuals who can in fact say, yeah, kids can do this. It requires some intentionality, but that's what good teaching takes regardless of the configuration. So quickly reviewing the 5 principles, we start by establishing gender literacy and giving kids a sense of what gender complexity really looks like. We help them distinguish patterns from rules and then emphasize physiology and parts and functions rather than the genders that are often associated with them. We talk about the different pathways to both bodies and to families. And regardless of the curriculum you're using, if you think about ways to apply these principles to the different lesson plans and activities, you will have a program that in fact, speaking to all kids, that meets your charge to provide the content you need to provide, but does so in a way in which every kid feels themselves represented and seen. So with that, I'm gonna pause, and we're doing great with time. So Nora, maybe we can hand it over to you and maybe even I can stop sharing and we can go ahead and pop up the other slides because I know we have some closing slides. Yeah. But meanwhile, Nora, let's go ahead and see what some of the questions are.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing people will now start populating more questions, but we did have one for people for you to start with, Joel. So here's a comment with a question in here for you. It says, we need to consider some educators and or parents are just not comfortable discussing human sexuality with their children and figure out a way to have people extremely comfortable with the material and open to questions without judgment. P.S. I'm a social worker. So maybe could you help us think through how this relates to people that just maybe generally don't have a high level of comfort with sexuality overall?
Yeah. And again, I think that's a great question. And of course, meeting people where they are means they're in a lot of different places. I do think that if we're going to ask individuals to teach this content, even if we're doing it in an absolutely binary traditional way, that discomfort is still going to be there for those individuals as well. And it's incumbent upon us to help teachers be able to, number one, state their level of comfort or discomfort. If we're asking someone who is inherently uncomfortable to teach content that they're uncomfortable with, that's a pretty big ask. And we certainly have an obligation both to our kids and to our colleagues to either help them become more comfortable, provide them with a partner, whether from the community or another educator, or handle it in a way that doesn't force someone into that discomfort. At the same time, a big piece of this is building the gender literacy of our colleagues, helping them become a little more comfortable with their discomfort, helping them realize that you don't have to be an expert about gender to be gender inclusive. And in fact, one of the most powerful ways to be gender inclusive is to model being a learner. There's a very wonderful quote I sometimes use in our trainings, and it goes to the effect of, in times of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned find themselves beautifully equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. And that's from Eric Hoffer. And what we really need to do for our colleagues who have varying levels of discomfort is to encourage them to take the stance of learners and to say, okay, if you're uncomfortable, let's talk about what's going to get you to feel more comfortable. And that to me becomes also the responsibility of systems to support our colleagues to get where they need to get, but also to hold them accountable to have a growth mindset that says, okay, you're uncomfortable, so let's get you to feel a little more comfortable if we're going to ask you to do this. But we do need you to do this, and let's get you to step up. Now, if you ultimately feel like an individual that you're going to put into that part, that space can't handle it, well, then I think that's almost an example of malpractice, right? To knowingly put people in positions where they will almost certainly fail. And I think this is where we sometimes allow, to confuse, and this is particularly in public spaces, people to say, well, my values and beliefs say that values and beliefs kind of need to get checked at the door when you work in a public institution in which all needs to mean all, and we don't get to pick which kids are safe and which ones aren't. And so that also is a leadership challenge to begin to say, okay, well, you're not comfortable, then let's get there, but we are gonna get there.
Great points. And now the floodgates have opened with lots of questions. So this next one came in from a couple of folks stating that the district they're working in is moving to co-ed sex education, and wondering if you have any research or evidence-based information that they can use to prepare their parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, there is not a lot of great research out there about configurations. I think it's beginning to be done. And so quite honestly, there's not a great body of research we can point to. I think in part, what we try to do is help our families that we work with, or help schools to work with their families to understand that the world their children are growing up in when it comes to gender is simply very different than the world most of us grew up in. And to help make the case, if you will, for why doing this work in mixed spaces is important, whether it's that, the vast majority of kids today are viewing gender much more broadly than even a generation before. It's very interesting to, for instance, compare youth in Generation Z, Gen Z youth, to even millennials, right? Their attitudes about gender, specifically identity more broadly, are much more nuanced than even the millennials, who of course are much more nuanced than the Gen Yers and the Gen Xers and, and some of us baby boomers. So, but I think in terms of making the case, we need to help them understand the trade-offs of having kids in separate groups. And there's compromises. Perhaps you're going to say, look, we're going to do most of the instruction in all gender groups, because I think as we learn about gender, we need to help folks realize, well, if we're separating by sex, we don't really know what's in every child's pants. And if we're separating by gender, we certainly know there aren't just boys and girls. And if we're, you can't do it cleanly. It's always been a kind of artificial line that we've drawn. But we can make the case with parents broadly about why having kids together really is in the kid's best interest. And then if necessary, some schools will elect to do a session based on, again, sometimes, okay, this will be a session for girls and this is going to be a session for boys. We would encourage you to frame it a little bit differently and perhaps say something along the lines of, all right, we are going to be doing some separate sessions. And in this session, we're going to be focusing on issues related to menstrual cycles and pregnancy. And in this session, we're going to be focusing on sperm production and, issues related to erections. And of course, erections happen in lots of different bodies, right? So again, grouping based on content, not gender. And again, if you're going to do those groups, try to have 3, simply so you're not just doing the binary. Because when we do things in a binary way, we're reinforcing this dominant model that simply doesn't work for everyone. And so simply having a 3rd category goes a long way to to interrupting that sense.
Great point. A couple of folks have asked a question related to how to change the emphasis on puberty education from reproduction, noting that a lot of current curricula kind of use the rationale of reproduction as the reason by which people's bodies go through puberty. Just wondering if you have any language adjustments to recommend there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example where many of those principles come together, right? So, Certainly, one of the things that happens when bodies become, when bodies start to take their adult form in all species is they have the ability to begin reproducing. And that's certainly part of the story. There's a pattern, it's simply not a rule. Part of what happens is your body gets larger. Part of what happens is there's certain changes that you now need to account for that you didn't have to account for before. Part of what happens is that, excuse me, certain illnesses and certain health issues start to emerge that you didn't have to. So again, I think we have to be careful of saying, let's make it so it's not at all about reproduction. Well, I don't know if that's effective, but also let's be careful that we're not saying it's only about reproduction. And instead say, what we're learning about is that your bodies are changing, and they're changing in a lot of amazing ways. You're all going to go through some changes. Peter Pan syndrome, it's not the thing. So unfortunately, right? And so now let's talk specifically about all the different implications that has, including reproduction, health, social issues related. Once we start talking about sort of gender literacy issues, we can begin talking about many of the implications that those bodies changing has. So I would say, again, let's move away from the all or nothing. It's not only about reproduction, but reproduction is part of the story.
Great, thank you. A couple of quick questions and then one that's a little more complex. So someone was wondering if you've received feedback from parents about these guidelines?
Yeah, I would say, well, not, this isn't the movies, right? It's not like we share this information and people say, oh my goodness, how brilliant you are, right? The feedback from educators, from parents, and we had the privilege of rolling this out in various conferences, including PTA conferences and other conferences, meeting the needs of parents. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. For many, many individuals, they've told us this actually has made them feel much more comfortable in how to talk about this, because what they haven't been able to talk about are some of the quote unquote exceptions to the rules. Well, if we get rid of the rules, then suddenly everything's sort of a possibility, and that it's really empowered them. That combined with, once more, adopting the stance of I don't have to be an expert. One of the most powerful things certainly parents can do to support these principles is share their own experiences, share how they felt growing up, how it felt like to be the most, physically advanced kid in the room or the least, right? What it felt like when, certain friends were having experiences you weren't having, bringing them in and sharing your own uncertainty. And as an adult, sharing, this is not an exact science in many ways. There's a lot of different experiences, and wonderment and uncertainty is part of the experience. And that's something that probably won't go away forever. So, but yeah, overall, the feedback from parents has been incredibly positive.
Awesome. Next quick question is, do you know off the top of your head, and you may not, the source of the statistic that 1/3 to 1/2 of transgender adults are parents?
I don't have that statistic. I don't have the source of that statistic. I can most likely find it, but I don't have what that source is. I think it's I'm guessing probably from the national transgender surveys that have been done. That might be a source.
Okay, great. And just as a reminder to folks that you'll be sent the presentation along with the document, the guideline document itself. Some people have been asking where to get that, so that'll be sent to you in an email likely tomorrow. One really terrific question here, it says, how do we align these guidelines with the traditional understandings of many of our Aboriginal communities in regards to gender, menstruation, etc., and relation to the ceremonies?
Oh, such a great question, and very interesting. I was just contacted last week by an organization which supports various rites of passage for young people of all genders. And I think when we're talking about gender literacy, one of the things we're talking about is that gender is very much impacted by culture, and the way cultures handle an individual's emergence of gender identity, including aspects of changing bodies and expression, are very much laden with rites of passage. And that there are so many different ways that different societies are recognizing this incredibly special time in a young person's life. And, I think also at the same time to point out, and in some cases, those traditional rites of passage are grounded in binary understandings. And in some cases, those societies, by definition, already have more expansive views of gender. But I think it is really critical to name that when we're talking about gender, certainly culture, which is all about what we sometimes refer to as social gender, is a huge influencer on every person's gender. The culture and the time in which we live, for all of us, greatly impacts our understandings of gender, whether it's about expression, whether it's about our bodies, or even whether it's about identities.
Great. And someone was just curious if you could name that organization that contacted you.
I'd rather not, honestly,
Totally
because we always have a commitment to our clients that we don't reveal that they're doing work with us, because some of them are a little nervous about that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But just look up, gender rites of passage, all genders, and you'll come across a number.
Great, thank you. And then real quick, I know we only have a couple minutes left and I want to get back to Caitlin for some final ASHA thoughts, but someone was asking, how would you define or describe transgender to fifth graders? I just wondered if you have a sentence or two off the top of your head.
Yeah, so we like to talk about how, many people when they're born are assigned a sex, and many people end up feeling, that that's who they are. Some people are assigned a sex where everyone thinks they're one thing, but they know there's something else. That is sometimes referred to as transgender. I will step back by saying we need to be really, more than defining terms for young people, we need to be helping young people recognize that language is very much in the eyes of the user, because transgender could also mean simply an individual who's not cisgender. Many non-binary individuals identify as trans or transgender, and many people identify as transgender in a very binary way. So a big part of gender literacy is helping kids understand that language is this approximation and it's incredibly personal. And so I can give a fifth grader a definition for transgender, and I would most likely do something very similar to what I said. But I would also then say to them, but as you grow up, you will encounter people who use that term to define themselves. And what really matters is how they're using it, because it can really mean different things to different people.
That's terrific. Great. Thank you so much, Joel. I think we got to most of the questions. A lot of people were offering suggestions and ideas in the chat to questions we weren't able to get to you. But knowing we have just a couple of minutes left, I will turn it back over to Caitlin to wrap it up.
Okay, so before we head out, I just want to remind everyone that we do have a couple of other upcoming webinars. The one, I believe it's next week, is about writing for publication, and that's going to be facilitated by one of the Journal of School Health editorial board members. And then in June, we have one on blending nutrition and education. And for those that are wanting continuing education credits, this webinar is eligible. Oh my gosh, it's the end of the day. Eligible for 1 CE hour, and that's for CHES, MCHES, CNEs, or also if you want a participation certificate. And ASHA members get those CEs for free. But you can obtain these CEs by filling out the evaluation. I put it in the chat box. And also I'll be sending it out via email tomorrow along with today's webinar resources. So go ahead and fill out that evaluation, especially if you want CEs, but also we want to hear your feedback. And so with that, just another reminder that our conference is in October. Registration is open, and we thank you all for attending today's webinar.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Joel. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.